Okay, well, first, thank you for being here in the Lille Comics Festival. And what are your thoughts after this first day? It's almost over, closing up within 2 hours. So, what are your first ideas, your first thoughts about this festival?
I think, you know, I've done a lot of American shows and a few British shows, and what's very different is I think the French audience is more interested in art and more appreciative of art, and not quite as interested in the stories and the characters, which is very refreshing. And everybody's been really hospitable, and it's been very busy and very warm upstairs. So, but this has been a great first experience at a French festival for me. Thank you.
Condition there next year, promise. Okay, well, you said about art, so have you got any artistic inspiration? An artist that inspired you when you work and made you feel like you could do something in the comic book industry?
Gosh, I have very strange creative influences. One of them, well, actually, it's funny you should say that, because one of my favorite books is Father Christmas by Raymond Briggs. And I was a huge fan of Raymond Briggs, you know, early on in my career, or actually before I had a career. I also am a big fan of Posy Simmonds. Are you familiar with Posy Simmonds over here? She did Gemma Bovary and Tamara Drew, which was adapted into a movie. And she used to do a big comic strip in a British newspaper called The Guardian. And she just had a really warm feeling to her artwork, and she wrote about a family, a very sort of liberal middle-class family, and a lot of liberal middle-class problems. It was a very sort of cozy comic strip, and it ran for many years, and then she started doing children's books. And you know, it's strange because Raymond Briggs does comic books that are children's books, and I think that's, if I was to write and draw, I would do something more like that, even though Posy's work was very adult and very cerebral in a way. But I was also, when I was you know, a teenager in the 80s, I was very influenced by Cerebus the Aardvark and Love and Rockets. And they were two of the very first creator-owned books, independent titles. They were black and white, they were published by the creators. And they were completely different to the books I'd written as a kid, reading Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, and most of the Marvel comics. So my influences are not what people expect, because I've worked in superhero comics so long, people think I love superhero comics. And I used to love superhero comics, and I think there's a great deal of great superhero comics out there. But I think we are... there's an embarrassment of riches in the comic book industry right now. We have so many fantastic people working in comics doing very, very different books. And who'd have thought a book about it, because not allowed to call them zombies in The Walking Dead, but who'd have thought a horror comic in black and white? People used to say, book, marine reading, fantastic book by Craig Thompson, who was the author of Blankets. And actually Craig Thompson's work is very similar to Posy Simmonds. So when I'm reading comics, I actually read things like Posy Simmonds and Habibi, Craig Thompson, a lot of the books that Top Shelf publish, fantastic people that publish at Top Shelf, and some really interesting and different books. So when you think of manga, you know, you can read manga in countries other than Japan now. You can read independent comics, you can read reprints of creepy and eerie. There's just a wealth of great comic book material right now, so it's a great time to be in comics.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting what you say, because maybe you're a part of those kind of readers that are looking for other heroes, maybe anti-heroes, not really heroes, because you're talking about Walking Dead and all of this. Maybe they are anti-heroes, which leads to my next question about Hip Flask and Elephant Man, because they are icons in the independent comic book world. And how would you describe it to our French readers, because they mostly don't know it, so, you know, try to sell it, it's time.
Actually, a lot of people do know Hip Flask in France, because we did a French edition of the first volume as an oversized hardcover, and Ladron just did a final incal with Jodorowsky. So because there's not much work by Ladron in that format, a lot of people have come to Hip Flask from incal. And, you know, even though I'd rather Ledron was working on Hip Flask, I was a big fan of Inkal, which was reprinted by Epic Comics and then by Graffiti Designs, which I worked for in the early 90s. So there is a lot of awareness of Elephant Men in Europe because Europeans are not frightened of science fiction comics. Americans seem kind of frightened by science fiction comics. Even though superheroes is a subgenre of science fiction, it's sort of become a genre to itself. And I think that, you know, the best superhero comics are soap operas. You know, Chris Claremont was perhaps one of the best superhero writers, Stan Lee, and he wrote, you know, superheroes with problems. And Elephant Men is human-animal hybrids with problems. So it's not really very different to superheroes, but it's also got a Blade Runner aesthetic. I grew up watching a lot of science fiction films: Planet of the Apes, Star Wars, Close Encounters, Alien. It's my favorite. Yes, and so, and in fact, we are now, you know. Anyone under 35 cannot remember a world without Star Wars. But, you know, when Star Wars came out, I was about 15 or 16, and there hadn't been any great science fiction films for a long time. There was things like Logan's Run, Planet of the Apes, but science fiction had not been a predominant genre, and science fantasy had not. Now there are a dozen great genre movies every year. And so, you know, my children are growing up accepting science fiction, science fantasy. My son Jet watches Clone Wars every week, and there's a sort of acceptance of fantasy that wasn't the case before movies like Alien, Blade Runner, Star Wars, and so forth, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, drove science fiction into the mainstream. And I think that we're in a culture now where cults are culture. You know, the sort of cultish pocket subcultures are now, you know, it's when there's a comic convention in town, like in San Francisco or San Diego, nobody blinks at seeing 50 stormtroopers on the street. That would have been, you know, kind of insane years ago. It used to be Klingons. There used to be Klingons at San Diego. Now it's stormtroopers. And then it'll be something else. You know, we see a lot of Jedi, we see a lot of people dressed up as various different things, but cosplay is much more accepted now, and it's sort of cooler to be geek now, and there's a sort of overlap. You know, if you want to be a rebel these days, don't get a tattoo. You know, it used to be the other way around. So it's the same in comics and science fiction. So, you know, I actually find that my audience is very welcoming to Elephant Men because it's grounded in all the things that I grew up in, which is the culture that we accept now.